Good morning. Winterview back again with another brief dialogue with his dear friend Annastacey. Once again, driving to work on a fine sunny Monday morning. Winterview discovered he had left his wetsuit in the car for 2 days after a surfing mission on the weekend. Rookie error, now paying the consequences with a smelly car. Unenlightened behavior, you might say. This morning's brief dialogue is following on somewhat on the latest theme of dialogues, a little bit more exploration around separation. Separation is the core presumption / energy dynamic that fuels or drives the machine of seeking. The sense of feeling separate, the idea of being separate, all blending together to create a existential angst or discomfort, you could say. So let's have a little more in-depth look. Let's put it under the microscope, so to speak. Why not on this fine Monday morning? I can't think of anything I'd rather be doing as I drive to work. So we have to go back and revisit the mind a little bit. A causal sort of agent, you could say, in this predicament. Now, the mind has many behaviors, or you could even say the brain has many behaviors. It doesn't matter, really, what terminology we use. One of the behaviors is to ascribe, or best approximate, cause, or try and describe the antecedent conditions by which an event will arise, if you're sophisticated. But in essence, the mind is always trying to presume cause, looking at what must have caused this. The reasons are numerous, I suppose. The most striking rationale for this behavior is probably most likely something to do with its survival or perceived survival value, to be able to predict and cause. To be able to predict cause would increase, hopefully, one's survival opportunities. And so there we are in what the mind thinks is a world that it lives in. The world of space-time, as I've often called it, where everything that the mind can frame or perceive, you could say, must have a cause, according to the mind. The mind is usually, more often than not, unaware that it has framed the world itself and is now trying to indeed find a cause for the world it's projected out there. We won't go into that mechanic today, the projection mechanic, you could call it. This is more about separation. Actually, that would factor into it, but we'll overlook it for the time being. So everything has a cause. Now, when it comes to most of the stuff of the world, there's not usually too much distress or discomfort from going around willy-nilly predicting cause or projecting cause here and there. The problem, you could say, arises when it turns its attention, that's the mind, turns its focus to consciousness or awareness itself, or even existence, you could say. When it turns its attention, now this is just a manner of speaking, it doesn't literally turn its attention, but to try and account for existence, to try and account for consciousness even, or just this awareness, you could say, what is the cause of consciousness? What is the a priori factor that gives rise to awareness, thinks the mind. The only logical answer that makes sense to the mind is that there must be someone, there must be a person who has consciousness, who is conscious, who is aware, etc. It naturally just slots it right in there without too much investigation, because how else could it be? The thinking might go. I mean, it's not like you're thinking about this constantly. It's just a natural functioning of brain or mind. So there must be someone. Now, the best evidence the mind has for this someone is that more or less there seems to be a body that is around all the time. And subsequently, the thoughts associated with consciousness or I or the person seem to somehow correlate to feelings and emotions within the body. And therefore the evidence as far as the mind is concerned is good enough. There must be someone there, someone in the middle or behind the scenes even, who has this consciousness. Now that right there, right in the looking in that little mechanic, is the sudden separation, the sense of separation from the totality. From that point on, if there's a person there who has consciousness or owns consciousness, then the reasoning has to sort of follow on from that so-called fact. The reasoning now must follow on that if the person has consciousness or is conscious, then it must be conscious of stuff, of things. So the world now is an appearance for the person. Everything that appears is appearing to me or for me. It's over there somehow, and I'm here and there, the duality. And it makes, the mind can more or less make sense of that dynamic. It doesn't seem to tax thinking, it doesn't seem to stretch credulity. More or less, that makes sense. But the sense of separation is fundamentally flawed. It's in some ways it's uncomfortable. It's like, what's a good analogy? It's like a shadow when, say, the sun is hitting a pole sticking out of the ground and the shadow is cast onto the ground. It's like someone saying you need to clean the shadow off the ground. And so as far as your mind is concerned, it's definitely there. You can see the shadow. But whenever you try and clean it, it doesn't work. And that's the dilemma of separation right there. Whenever you try and ascribe meaning or purpose or agency or qualities to this self, it's like cleaning the shadow. You can definitely see this person as far as you're concerned, but everything you try and do to this shadow, so to speak, doesn't work. For instance, the idea that the person is an independent, autonomous agent, lovely sentiment, really, feels good to be the agent of your life. And sometimes it really feels like you are. Really, the conditions marry up beautifully to make it seem like you really are doing stuff. You might think, I will raise my hand into the air, and you raise your hand, and you think, wow, see, I controlled that, I did that. But what about the stuff that you don't want? That seems to happen an awful lot. Even, for example, taking a very simple example, what about a negative thought? Negative thoughts often arise very regularly for a lot of people, almost minute by minute, or instant by instant in some cases if you're particularly distressed. If you were indeed the agent of your life, the boss, so to speak, you would just simply stop having them. I would just decide, I don't want to think negatively anymore, I just want to think positively. I want to think wonderful thoughts about myself all day long, merrily, merrily, merrily. However, as most of you listening will know, it just doesn't seem to work like that. And so suddenly this agent that you thought you were, who could control your life and direct behavior, etc., seems rather impotent, a bit flimsy. No matter, though, for the mind will incorporate that lack of power into the story very seamlessly. It's as if the mind will perhaps use denial or repression or suppression to rid itself of the idea that the person is somehow flawed, and will perhaps project cause out there. The reason I had the negative thought, not my fault, it was someone annoyed me, so therefore that's why the negative thought came. I could not have those thoughts if I so chose, but it just was bad luck. Something like that. So there's the desperate attempt by the mind to make the sense of separation work and make sense, trying desperately to keep the idea of the person as whole, as valid, etc. But it's a shadow. It's a presumption, and the evidence is flimsy. The sense of separation, therefore, adds another peculiarity to life. The sense that if there is indeed a person there who life is happening to, that has actual existence, has substance, then that person should be able to feel like it's part of life or part of the world, it's in the flow, all these wonderful feelings that you might like, but it can never quite make that happen. It can't really get that going. Sometimes it goes for a little bit, you sustain it for an hour, maybe a day, then at the end the energy that is required to sustain that, we'll call it illusion, can't be sustained, and you always feel somewhat on the outside of life. And in the mental health world, one of the most common things you'll hear people report is I feel like I'm missing out on something, not getting something, I'm or waiting for something to happen. That real sense, they don't know, they wouldn't use sort of spiritual or pseudo-spiritual terminology like separation and that, well, generally they don't. But that's exactly what the feeling is. This sense that I'm always on the outside of the world. It's like a lacking of intimacy with the world. And we could go on and describe how that lacking of intimacy, sense of separation, could lead to defensiveness, defendedness, armoring, etc. This person now that the mind believes must exist somewhere behind the scenes, the mind, to try and, I guess, come back into life, to try and bring this person into life, tries to own stuff. It tries to own, first and foremost, qualities about the person. It wants to be a good person, a nice person, a wholesome person, a valid person, a beautiful person, intelligent person, a wealthy person, a person who has respect, a person who is useful, has utility in some way to society, and so forth. And whenever it finds a little bit of evidence for that, it tries to cling desperately to it, while trying at the same time to repel all the negative stuff, pushing it away constantly. I'm not that, I'm not that, I'm this, I'm not that, I'm not that. And it's a dance that requires enormous psychic energy takes up your mental resources trying to sustain that dance. And here's the thing. If we go back to the shadow analogy for a moment, there's the shadow. Let's make it even more interesting. It's not just a shadow of a stick, but it's now a shadow puppet. If you've ever seen, I think they're Indonesian, I could be wrong, shadow puppets, you watch the puppet show on a screen and the puppeteers are behind with actual puppets which cast the shadow onto the screen. So now imagine you've got a mannequin, like one of those store clothing dummies things, and the sun is hitting that and casting a shadow onto the ground. So now this actually looks like what you would call a person. There's the person, this black shadow on the ground. And then we put an apple, a real apple, on the ground next to the shadow. And the goal is, how can the shadow eat the apple? How is this shadow going to pick the apple up and eat it? Well, it's a complete nonsense. Of course the shadow, and we'll give it a little bit of sentience, so the shadow will decide, oh, I'm going to eat that apple. How is a shadow going to eat an apple? Damn it! Think about it. How on earth would a shadow eat an apple? How, now extrapolate from that, how would a shadow do anything? You could say the shadow can exist, perhaps, give a little concession. It's got its existence, but how is it going to do stuff? And we could even remove the existence. We could even say the shadow doesn't exist. There's just an absence of light. Bam, shadow's gone. So there we have the core, you could say the core dilemma for the imagined person. It wants to do stuff. It thinks it's doing stuff, but it can't. It can't even draw a breath. How is that person going to draw a breath? I'm trying to think of minuscule things. How is that person going to blink? Can't even do that. So now the whole question about what should I do? What should the person do? Should I meditate? Should I become a vegetarian? Should I sit with an enlightened master? When will enlightenment happen to me? When will I become realized? What spiritual practices should I do? Suddenly become a nonsense. What do you mean? What would this shadow do? You could say, a shadow can't do anything. It can't do anything. So now there's this awful, I guess if you were the shadow in this analogy, realization. I want to do things. I feel separate from the world. I'm trying my best to do things, but I never can seem to do anything. Nothing ever seems to work. There's the existential angst right there. Right there. I can't own anything. I can't get close to life. I feel like I'm juggling all the time to make life work. I'm trying to do stuff that I think is good and avoid stuff that I think is bad, and so on and so forth. An awful, awful state of affairs for the shadow, at least. This poor shadow. So that's all I really wanted to talk about this morning, and also my drive is coming to an end. You might notice a correlation between the length of my drive to work and the length of my brief dialogues. This was just a little, once again, taster, like you're at a restaurant, non-duality restaurant, sampling the menu, a sampler menu, a degustation menu. Oh my god, I've really butchered that word. I better stop while I'm ahead. Thanks again for listening. As usual, your comments are very welcome.